Welcome back to the universe of God. I want to thank you for tuning in as we continue on with part 9 in the tale of two messiahs. We are now covering more of Messiah ben David in this portion of the series, and we touched on the lineage of Christ and his connection to King David, and how we are seeing throughout the Old Testament Messianic figures that reflect not only the character of Christ, but point us to him when he comes, so that we know these attributes that are associated with him throughout the whole Bible. And another thing that is interesting is that Yeshua, was surprised at how the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots were not able to tell who he was. They were not able to discern and know that he was the Son of God, that he was the expected Messiah that they had been waiting years for and talking about for thousands of years since the beginning. But when we investigate the scriptures as we have done in just the tale of two messiahs, we ourselves in the universe of God have discovered, maybe separately or together now at this point, how Jesus has been written about in the volume of the books. The Messiah has been pointed to time and time again throughout scriptures, and he definitely has been foreshadowed in some of the stronger figures in the Old Testament who have really made great gains in the Bible. So we've seen this foreshadowing as we've talked about Joseph, even Moses and how he brought the law and kept, the law. But Joshua, the son of Nun, and how he led the Israelites into the promised land, which was a reflection of God's grace and mercy on them because they weren't able to keep all of the law, but yet they went into the promised land. We've talked about him being connected to, Christ figures such as Boaz in the Old Testament and King David. Now we're here with King David. So as I try very hard to finish out this series, I'm going to bring in bonus material later in future series in my next portions of the series. However, I want to finish out as much as I can with the Messiah ben David and this connection to King David. I've already provided some information, but I want to go a little further here as we focus on how Messiah is the coming king. He is the crucified king, the crowned king, and the conquering king. I recently came across a study also titled The Tale of Two Kings, and it really further enhanced not only my understanding, but I felt like it could really add to our study. So I'm just going to touch on these quick points, being that we're talking about King David and how he was a shepherder, but he was a mighty man. He was mighty from the time he was a child. He was faced with a bear and he overcame the bear and lived. He overcame the lion and lived. And these are not metaphors. These are literal things that he was attacked by these animals and he overcame. Then we see him overcoming Goliath, a giant in the Bible, one of the, remnant of giants from the Rephaim, or the Nephilim, that are talked about in the Old Testament. But now we see David was chosen as the second king of Israel, a paralleling here of Jesus, who comes once and comes second in his kingly authority, coming to rule and to reign and to judge the nations. So we discussed how, they both King David reflected a spirit of obedience and excellence, and how Christ, Yeshua, has reflected a spirit of excellence, and he was obedient unto death when concerning the fulfillment of the law. This was no small matter. He was chosen. He was the one who could do this, who could fulfill all of the law. Moses did his best, but even he didn't enter into the promised land, which is hard for some of us to conceive. But again, the Old Testament is showing us how we couldn't keep all of the law. We needed, Messiah to come and sacrifice his life for us, and to come under this covenant of grace during this age of Pisces that we have been in for 2,000 years plus. So I just want to go into these connections here with the coming king, the crucified king, the crowned king, and the conquering king. So we see the coming king. David was anointed as king of Israel, as mentioned in 1 Samuel 16 and 13. But he had to wait until Saul died to become the king of Israel. And we talked about how David was hunted by Saul throughout this time of, waiting, of being chosen king and anointed king, but actually coming into the full position of king and sitting on the throne, which is interesting. So Jesus, we see, is also the coming king. In Matthew 2:2, where he is, where it said that he that is born king of the Jews. And then later he rides in on a donkey during Passover, down the streets of Jerusalem crying. The crying of the prophet Zechariah is reflected here in this story, where it says, "Behold, your king is coming to you, lowly and sitting on a donkey," which was in Zechariah 9:9, and in Matthew 21:5. And then Yeshua is Israel's king, and he indeed has already arrived the first time, but they would receive him, of course, and or reject him. And he is also the coming king, who is coming a second time to redeem his people, those who have chosen to accept the gift of salvation through this way, through this particular door that has been said to be the way, the truth, and the light, or life. And it says life everlasting on top of it. So it's not just about the life here, but our everlasting life after we face death, which we all know that we're going to face. It's not a mystery. We see the crucified king. David was not literally crucified like Christ, but he did indeed have many problems, and he did suffer persecution. They crucified him, meaning they gave him, he had such a tough time. I mean, he was hunted and sought after by King Saul viciously. And David's life was spared several times. He truly did suffer, and it was a form of crucifying his flesh before he became king. David was humbled. He didn't just become king and jump right into it. He suffered and was humbled. He lived in the mountains, in the caves, in the elements, fighting off enemies all around for years. So he was not only, strengthened, but he was crucified in this manner before he could actually possess the throne. And there's so many lessons in what King David had to suffer before he actually ascended on the throne. How his character was developed, how he learned obedience through sacrifice and suffering, how he learned to be truly and utterly dependent on God in such a way before he became king of Israel during this time. So, we see further that he had, troubles with Bathsheba, as in 2 Samuel 11. With his family, he had troubles. Ammon's immorality and Absalom's murder of Ammon later on in his life. And even with, his nation and the revolt of Sheba's revolt, that's in 2 Samuel 19 and 20. So, there's a lot that he suffered before he was king and even when he was on the throne. Jesus Christ endured the literal crucifixion by the Roman authorities. In John chapter 1, verse 11, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. Even his own disciples forsook him in his time of need. When he was going to the cross, they denied him. Judas, one of his disciples, betrayed him. And he didn't just betray Jesus or Yeshua, but he betrayed him with a kiss, the kiss of death. He was taken before Anna, then Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, then to Pilate and Herod, and finally back to Pilate. This crucifixion was a process here. And then finally, the Jews demanded that he be crucified. And that's in John chapter 19, verse 6. He was beaten, bruised, for our iniquities, for our sins. He was crucified for us. And there is truly no one like Jesus Christ. There never really has been in terms of the fullness of him. We see elements that reflect him in other people, but suffering to the point of death is where he put the icing on the cake, so to speak, right? How is that? Because no one died for their people. Christ died for his people. So even though we see people reflecting Christ's character, his sacrifices, some of his sufferings, very closely, even King David, when it comes to dying for his people, when he is innocent, that is something that only Jesus, Yeshua, has done. And he was the spotless, blemish-free lamb that was slain for all. No one can take that title. And in addition, the Bible says that he overcame death, hell, the grave. And no one has ever done that. Jesus, or Yeshua, is also the crowned king, just as David was the crowned king. He was anointed king 3 times. The first time King David was anointed, 1024 BC in Bethlehem. That's in 1 Samuel 16, verse 1 through 13. The second time, 13 years later in 1011 BC. That's in 2 Samuel 2, verse 1 through 7. And then the third time, some 7.5 years later in 1004 BC. So Jesus was also crowned king. In John 6 and 15, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself, because even though he was king, he was not allowing them to crown him king in this nature. Jesus would not allow things to happen before their time. So it was not the time for him to be crowned king in this way, okay? But we see, that as a crucified king, he was crowned with a crown of thorns when they mocked him. But either way, they were determining and they were declaring that he was indeed a king, and they were crowning him. But see, he was crowned in suffering the first time. And he mentioned that, the earthly kingdom was not of his kingdom. Because if it was, many would have come to his rescue. Angels would have come and fought for him. He said his kingdom was not of this world. So he was a king in heaven. And he was a king on the earth, but he was not crowned as the royal king that he truly was. And we see that again when he is crucified. He's the conquering king. So we see that David is also the conquering king. He had many victories, many victories. I'm going to include a link that discusses all these things in detail with scriptures regarding the crowned king, the conquering king, the crucified king, and the coming king. But for the sake of time, the conquering king, we see that David had many victories and he overcame. And we see that Jesus had many victories and he overcame. And he's going to come and defeat his enemies once and for all when he returns the second time as Messiah ben David. Come back for part 10 as we go further